Okay, welcome everybody. Just while everyone's coming through the door, we've got a really good webinar lined up today, and as usual, what we've asked Luke to do is just to tell the story about what the University of York does and how they use SFIA. It's not scripted by the SFIA Foundation. It's an example of the framework being flexible and used in many different ways. Last time around, we had the University at South Florida who were talking about their use of SFIA with their IT teams. Now, this user story is about another university, but this time is actually with the students on their work placement year. So it's a different type of story. We've had a lot of interest in this one, and just the latest update across the two sessions, we've had people registering from 33 different countries around the world. Which is a fantastic response, and I guess a signal about the use of SFIA in many different locations around the world. We really enjoy that fact about the way SFIA is used. So for people who are just joining in now, if you could just use the chat and just let me know it's working, just put in where you're from and what the weather's like or any other comments like that. The way we're going to play this one, Luke's going to talk for a few minutes, and then we will have a pause for some questions. What we'd like to do as you think of questions, or when we reach a stage when we're doing questions, is to use the Q&A function. So the Q&A part of Zoom, that's really helpful for us because we can answer the questions, we can tick them off and say we've done them, and it also keeps a record of the questions for use after the webinar. If you use the chat is a good thing to do if you've just got any comments that aren't questions you want Luke to respond to, or if you're putting in links to other resources or other ideas, please use the chat. So make use of both in slightly different ways. That helps us. Okay, so I think we can hand over to Luke to get us going.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Peter, for that introduction. I will just share my slides now. So hopefully everybody can see that okay.
Yep.
Great, perfect. So hello everyone. As Peter said, my name's Luke. I work in the computer science department at the University of York. And in today's session, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we have integrated SFIA into our student placement year assessment process. So very quickly, just to get started, I just wanted to give you a brief introduction to myself. So I'm the relationships manager here in the department. I was originally a history graduate many moons ago now, sadly, and then subsequently completed a master's degree in careers guidance and development. So my background is very much in that kind of careers employability kind of area. I've not got a specific background in kind of tech or IT at all. I've been working at the university now for 4.5 years with responsibility for managing industry relationships. So I look after all of the kind of employer relationships that we've got in the department and all the kind of organisations that we work with. I've also got responsibility for student employability. So this is just around making sure our students have the right skills and experiences they need to kind of be successful in the graduate labour market once they've completed their degree with us here at York. So just some background again on the university itself and the department. So the University of York is a top 20 UK university and a member of the Russell Group. So the Russell Group are just a group of UK universities that are research intensive and academically excellent. The department itself has just celebrated its 50th anniversary this year. So as a computer science department, we're kind of very well established and we've been going for a long period of time now. And again, we're one of the UK's leading computer science departments. In terms of the student body, we have roughly 800 undergraduate students in the department with us. And those students are split across 4 different courses. So we have a straight computer science course. We have computer science with an AI specialism, computer science with a cybersecurity specialism, and then we do a combined course with mathematics as well. And all of those undergraduate courses have the option to be taken with an additional year in industry placement. So moving on, just to give you a bit of background about how the Year in Industry itself works. So the Year in Industry programme essentially enables students to work for a year as a formal accredited part of their degree. So our students will complete years 1 and 2 of their course with us. They'll then go out to an employer to work for a year, and then they'll return to the university to complete their degree after that year in industry. Around half of our undergraduate students will take this option up and go out on a placement year. So in terms of numbers, we've got roughly 80 or so students a year going out and doing this kind of placement. Our students will undertake placements with a variety of different companies and across quite a broad range of role types as well. So the way we kind of run it at York, we have probably 25 to 30 companies that we've got a really close relationship with, and the majority of our students will go on placement to those companies every year. Students will also sometimes source their own placements as well, and obviously we try to develop new relationships with new companies, so there is new opportunities coming, new companies that we bring on board each year, but we do have that core of companies where we know that we know what experience the students are going to get, and we know the types of role that the students are going to be doing. I've mentioned that there's a variety of role types, so the majority of our students will probably do software engineering, software development type roles. However, we'll have students doing kind of all kinds of broad range of placements. So we'll have students doing cybersecurity placements, placements around data analysis. We might have students doing IT project management type roles. So there's really quite a variety there, and our only kind of requirement really is that there is some link to kind of computer science or IT, and that's kind of the only requirement we have. But obviously what that means with those range of roles is that we do need a degree of flexibility in the way we assess students, and that's one of the ways that SFIA really works for us, and I'll kind of loop back onto how that works when I talk in a bit more detail about the kind of assessment process. Just the logos around the side of the screen as well, they're just I just wanted to give you a snapshot of some of the kind of regular partners that we work with in terms of where our students go out for their placement year. So for the year itself, students are registered in a 120 credit placement module, so it's a kind of credit bearing module. However, it doesn't count towards the students' overall degree mark, so it's a pass-fail year essentially. So the students need to pass the year to get the year in industry as a part of their degree, but it's not graded in the sense of counting towards their overall kind of mark at the end of their university course. So during the year itself, students are assigned a supervisor from the university. So whilst they're obviously working for a year, they're still classed as a full-time student, and we have a duty of care towards them. So that supervisor acts, I guess, essentially in a pastoral kind of capacity, and keeps in regular touch with the students via email, via video call. They may go and visit the student in the workplace as well. And as well as that pastoral piece, the supervisor is also supporting students with the assessment process as well, so ensuring that the student is meeting all the requirements that we ask for in terms of the assessment. And for the assessment itself, what we ask students to do is they complete a reflective learning journal and also a poster that summarises their experiences of the year. And in terms of the poster, what we do is we run a poster fair when students return, where they'll present their poster, they'll speak to students who are considering doing the year in industry. So it's a bit of a kind of promotional event for us and gets other students interested in the year in industry. And in terms of that assessment, we bring in the SFIA skills and behaviours into the assessment process. Again, I'll move on to that on the next kind of slide in terms of how we do that. But we've been using SFIA to do this for many, many years now. As I said, I've been at the university for about 4.5 years now, but this was well established when I kind of joined, so it's something that's been, it's a program that's well established and has been running successfully for quite a number of years now. So that's kind of the background. So I'll refer back to Peter to see if there's been any questions before I move on to the specifics of how we do the assessment with SFIA.
Okay, so we've not had any questions yet, but what we thought, we'd just pause here because Luke's presentation is 2 sections. So this was just setting up what the scheme's about and how it works. So if anyone's got any specific questions about that, we could field those now. But if not, we can move on, and then Luke will get more into the detail of how SFIA is applied to this. Okay. If you do have questions, I know as things go forward, things spring to mind, but we're really keen to get questions. Luke's primed to respond and answer to the questions. So if you're thinking of questions, others will be thinking of something similar. So please have them, but okay to save them for later. Oh, hang on, we have got a question coming in. Let's see. Yep. Okay. Thanks, Porrick. So it's a question, but Porrick's asking how similar or different is to how other parts of the university work. So are there other year-in industries or similar things?
Yeah, so every department and course, the undergraduate course in the university does have a year in industry option or a placement year option. So everyone does have this program. Obviously how the assessment works varies from department to department, but essentially most people's assessment is fairly similar from my understanding in terms of a reflective report tends to be the key component. So there's definitely a degree of similarity in terms of how all the different departments run, I would say.
Okay, thanks, Luke. I think if you progress to the next bit now, that'd be great.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, so moving on to the specifics then. So how does the assessment actually work? I think, as I mentioned, students complete a reflective learning journal. That's the key part of their assessment. That's typically around 3,000 words in length. We just give this for guidance for students. It's not like a hard limit or anything. And I guess the key focus really is for students to kind of look back on their learning throughout the year and to kind of highlight their own personal development. So we're getting students to think about the skills they've learned, skills they've developed, how they've progressed, challenges they've perhaps overcome. So they're just sort of looking back over the year and thinking about that personal development essentially. As part of this, students select 2 technical skills from the SFIA framework to be assessed against. And this will obviously vary dependent on the kind of placement they're doing. Our most commonly selected skills are programming and testing, because students are most frequently doing software development type roles. But they can essentially be any skill across the framework that students want to select. I had a quick look at this year's assessments, and we had 20 different skills that students selected in total. So there's quite a variation there. So we support students in terms of selecting the most appropriate skills for their placement. As I said previously, we've got a lot of employers we work very closely with, so we've got a good idea typically when a student goes into a placement what they're going to be doing. So we will generally signpost students to the types of skill that we think are going to be most appropriate for their particular placement. Students will probably have a reasonable idea at the start of the placement, so they might sort of have a couple of skills in mind. However, that may well change as the placement progresses, and students sort of move between different projects, or just get a better understanding of the type of work that they're completing. So this is kind of an ongoing process essentially, and students don't need to kind of make a hard decision right at the start of the placement. In terms of our expectations, we find that students generally start the year at level 2 and work towards and potentially achieve level 3 by the end of the placement. And that would be the case for the vast majority of our students. There might be very rare occasions where a student might, for instance, have done some previous industry experience and therefore might potentially work towards level 4. But for nearly all of our students, they would start at level 2 and work towards that level 3 standard. Now, one of the things we find is that students will sometimes think they may be working at a higher level, so they might select level 4. So there's often a kind of a two-way conversation where we maybe go back and challenge a student and get them to actually consider whether they're actually meeting all of the requirements for that level, whether they're working towards the SFIA behaviours as well as the skills. So there's definitely a two-way process whereby we ensure students are kind of selecting the appropriate level, and we're kind of assessing them against that appropriate level as well. So alongside the technical skills, students have a range of learning outcomes that they need to meet. So the learning outcomes are what determines whether they pass or fail the year. So that's essentially the learning outcomes associated with a placement module. And these learning outcomes are aligned to the level 3 SFIA behaviours. So these are the kind of soft skills that run alongside those technical skills. On the next slide, I've got a list of the ones we use, so hopefully that will sort of start to make sense when I move on to that. And yeah, the last point on this slide is we kind of provide formative feedback for the students kind of on an ongoing process via the placement supervisor. So the students are kind of supported at each step of the process to ensure that they're kind of meeting all the objectives that they need to meet, and kind of, yeah, selecting the appropriate skills as well. So this is what our learning outcomes look like. This is not every aspect of the level 3 SFIA behaviours, but I think the majority of them are in here, and we've selected the ones that we feel are kind of most appropriate for our placement process. You'll see that 4 of those are starred, so we've got 4 core ones. So essentially, students need to meet all 4 of the core ones. So you've got one there around planning and monitoring work. You've got one around performing a broad range of work, one around communication, and one around taking the initiative to develop their own knowledge. I guess the reason we selected those particular skills is because we think they're really important skills for our students to show, but also they're relatively generic, so they allow us to appropriately assess students who are doing, as I said, quite a variety of different roles. And so we feel that all our students, whether they're doing a software development or an IT project management role, will all have the opportunity within their placement to give good examples and good evidence of how they meet those particular objectives. Alongside the 4 core objectives, students need to demonstrate at least 2 additional ones, so they can select any 2 of the additional ones listed there. And quite often students will cover more than 2 additional ones. But again, we don't ask them to complete them all because we're aware that not every student will have the opportunity to demonstrate each and every one of these skills, but they should be able to do the 4 core ones and at least 2 additional ones. So apologies if this is a bit small and you might not be able to see this, but I'll talk through it. So this is just a screenshot from our learning journal template. So we give this to students to help them with that kind of writing up process of the learning journal. So this is the 3rd section of the journal. The first section is just kind of where a student will give a bit of a job description, talk about what they're doing. And the second section is where they will set out their objectives for the year. But this is the main section of the journal. And so I'll just briefly run through this, and hopefully that'll give you an idea of how those learning objectives and technical skills kind of look in the actual journal itself. So we start off by asking students to just do a brief introduction. So they're just giving an overview of the company and their role and how that role fits into the sort of wider scope of the structure, wider scope and structure of the company. We'll get students to talk about their induction period. So this is the first 2 to 3 weeks of the placement where they're kind of having that onboarding and that training process. We get students to reflect on what they've learned, whether that initial period kind of matched their expectations. And then they get onto the kind of core area of their work. So it might be talking about their first project, if they're sort of working on project-based work, or just their first kind of key piece of work. So we ask students to describe what they've been doing. And within that kind of descriptive process, they'll bring in the technical skills they've selected and start to give evidence of how they have met those different requirements for level 3. So they'll do that within that kind of descriptive process of what they've been doing. We'll get students to talk about kind of the purpose of the work they're doing, what their role was within that piece of work. And then we ask them to start bringing in those examples of those learning objectives that I mentioned. So getting the students to think about how they plan the approach to their work, how they work towards and met deadlines, getting students to think about any issues or challenges they faced, how they overcame those challenges, and then thinking about the outcome of the work, and then that again, that reflective aspect of thinking about what they've learned, what they might do differently next time around. And then essentially that's the kind of core structure, and students will kind of repeat that for each project or each different piece of work that they get involved with. And then at the end of the process, you know, they'll have a summary section, And again, this is just overall kind of looking back at the placement, evaluating how it went, whether it met their expectations, whether they developed all of the kind of skills that they were hoping to do. And they're just, I guess, their key takeaway experiences from the placement. And that essentially is how the core sort of structure of the journal actually looks. So what I wanted to do next was just to give you a couple of extracts, just so you can see how this actually sort of comes together when a student's actually writing up their journal. Not expecting you to kind of read all the way through this, but I'll just kind of highlight some key points. So this first extract here is a student where they're focusing predominantly on those learning objectives. So in bold, I've kind of highlighted where they have given examples and evidence of those learning objectives. So you can see at the top there, they're talked about planning and scheduling their work and working towards deadlines. So that was one of the core learning objectives that we asked students to meet. The student talks about escalating an issue to a higher level, which again is one of the optional competencies that the students need to work towards. And then at the bottom there, the student has an example of communication skills as well. So again, that's kind of one of the core objectives. So in that couple of paragraphs, you can see the students given several examples of those learning objectives and given evidence of how they've kind of worked towards and begin to meet those particular objectives. And this second example is an example of a student working towards one of the technical skills. So this is a student that's selected testing, and they're working through here and starting to give evidence of the different requirements for testing at level 3. So I think they've given sort of 2 or 3 examples here of the different things that they've worked on to bring them up towards that level 3 skill. So hopefully between those 2 examples, that gives you a bit of an idea of how the student's journal actually looks and how they give those examples for the learning objectives and how they give those examples for the technical skills. So I think that is another break point, and I will see now from Peter if we've had any questions at this point.
Yes, we have. We've got some good questions coming through. So thanks everyone who's been putting those in. So the first one is from Phil. I'll just read out Phil's question. It might need a bit of clarification. So Phil's asked, what is the rate of full-time employment of students who completed the Industry Links placement?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, actually. The latest data we have, and it's not that up to date, it's quite difficult to get this data. So from the last data from a few years ago, so actually we're at a point where every student that had done a placement was in full-time graduate employment after that, 12 months, was it 18 months after graduation. So we did have 100% success rate. So it's very, very high, the number of students that do go on to get graduate employment. Not necessarily with their placement provider, but overall. And again, anecdotally, I'd say around half the students do actually get a placement offer from the placement provider that they're actually with as well. So in terms of student employability, it's really, really good.
Okay, thanks, Luke. And a couple of questions from Michelle. So let's start with that one there, which is twisting it around a bit. So Michelle's saying, learn more about the students' expectations of employers during their placements and the extent to which their expectations are met.
Yeah, so to what extent the student expectations met during the placement year?
What are they expecting from the employers? So I guess it's saying, how do employers meet what the students' needs are on the placement? Yeah, so is this from the assessment perspective, or are we talking? Or I think if you just answer from getting the right sort of work or the support in work.
Yeah. So I mean, I think so I'll kind of go back to the kind of recruitment process and how it works. So we, as I mentioned earlier, we have about 25 to 30 companies we work really closely with, and what we actually do is we invite those companies in to meet with the students at the start of the year. So they will do like a presentation and networking session with the students where they'll talk about what the role involves, and they'll usually bring along current placement students. So the students actually get a really good idea of what the company can offer at that early stage and get to meet with the company and chat to all the, the kind of representatives. So actually going in, the students are able to make a really informed choice in terms of which company is going to be best for them. And again, because we've worked with most of the companies for a long period of time, we know that those companies we work closely with, do offer the students a really good experience, and that's why we continue to work with them. I guess we do obviously start working with new companies sometimes, so then it becomes a bit of a slight unknown. And I guess in that instance, we just try to, when we're working with them, we'll try and meet with them, chat with them beforehand, and just give them a kind of overview of what our expectations will be to kind of ensure that they can give the student a good experience when they go out there.
Thanks, Luke. Michelle, just drop a note if that's not quite what you were looking for. Anna was asked, I guess you have a template for the journal, so I think that you do have quite a lot of documentation that goes around
Yeah, so that kind of snapshot I showed on the previous slide is a part of the template that we give to the students just to help them kind of structure the journal, give them some guidance. So the students get that as a template to help them. Alongside that, we have a kind of guidance document. So it essentially talks through each different section of the journal and kind of gives students guidance in terms of what they need to include and what they need to cover in each of the different sections. So there's quite a lot of documentation that goes along with that. And as I say, we also do those during the kind of meetings that we have as supervisors. We kind of give students advice and guidance as well, and cover any kind of questions or anything that they're not sure about during those meetings as well.
Okay, thanks, Luke. I'll do another couple of questions. Some of the questions I think you'll address in your subsequent slides. So there's a couple here which are about how do you orientate students to SFIA, and then a related one from Paul. So that was from Phil. From Paul, how familiar are the placement providers with SFIA? Does the uni need to provide details on SFIA?
Yeah, so in terms of the students, this is actually an area that we're trying to do a bit more work on, because students are obviously only introduced to SFIA at the start of their placements. It's not something they're familiar with beforehand. So I guess what we do at the moment is that we essentially give students some documentation at the start of the placement, where we just kind of highlight the basics essentially, and get students to start looking through some of those skills that we think are relevant to them. So we get them to, we kind of signpost them to the bits that we think are going to be most relevant for them, and get them to kind of do that initial kind of exploration essentially. But I do definitely think this is an area that we can do a bit more, and it's actually something we're looking at now in terms of how we can get the students to have a better understanding of the basics at the start of their placement. So hopefully that's one area where we can do a little bit more with the students. And the other side to that question, how familiar are the employers? So I guess the answer to that is it's variable. Again, the employers that we work with regularly do tend to have a good overview of SFIA, and that definitely helps if the supervisors know that. I guess one of the issues is, even if it's a company you've worked with, it might be a new supervisor or someone that's not so familiar with it. So we actually find that it's not the way we do the assessment. It's not essential the supervisors are familiar with SFIA, but obviously it's beneficial if they are. So yeah, it is very variable. And yeah, what I would say is some companies actually do use SFIA internally, and in those instances it really marries up with what we do, and it does help, but it's not essential. It's a nice to have if they if they have that experience.
Okay, look, I think we'll go on to the next ones. I guess what you're saying there, because the SFIA level descriptions provide things in a way that the employer and the student recognise around the work, that they don't necessarily need to know all the ins and outs that go around the design of the framework and things like that. Okay, so yeah, please go ahead, Luke.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, I just wanted to move on to kind of assessment outcomes. So what happens once the students have submitted their journal? So obviously we mark the journals, and what we do is we assess students in their selected SFIA skills, and in most cases the outcome will be developed increased competence towards level 3 in those skills, or they will have achieved level 3. That is the outcome in nearly all cases. And then, as I kind of mentioned earlier, very rarely we might get a student working towards level 4, but in the vast majority of cases it will be working towards or achieving level 3. We give all students a certificate with the skills that they've worked towards and the level that they've achieved, and then that's something that can obviously go onto their CV and they can use as a talking point in interviews. Students also receive a pass or fail grade from the university for the year, alongside some written feedback. And we also work with an independent SFIA consultant who will moderate a sample of our journals. So this just gives us reassurance, essentially, that we're kind of marking the journals appropriately and we're assessing students against those SFIA skills in a fair and a kind of appropriate way, essentially. So just moving on to the roles involved. So as relationships manager, I'm kind of got overall responsibility for the year in industry programme. And I also act as a supervisor, student supervisor and marker. I actually probably do that for the majority of students. But I also have a small team of university supervisors and markers who also work with me on this. We do try to keep that relatively small, just because it's a lot easier to ensure sort of consistency of approach and consistency of marking if you keep it relatively small in terms of the number of people involved. So obviously the student's workplace supervisor is a key person involved in this as well, particularly in the start in terms of that goal setting process. Also obviously monitoring the student's progress throughout the year. The supervisor will also provide student feedback at the end of the year. So that's one of the points I didn't mention in terms of the journal, that supervisor will write up some feedback for the student, and that will be considered by us as part of that kind of marking process at the end of the process once the students have submitted the journal. Obviously the student's key to all of this. The student's the one doing the placement, doing the assessment, so probably don't need to go into any more detail on the student themselves. And then, as I mentioned previously, we have a SFIA consultant we work with for moderation, but we've also used a SFIA consultant for training purposes as well. So they've run a training session for myself and some of the team to ensure we've got a good understanding of the basics of SFIA, so we can mark those journals in an appropriate way. And then I wanted to talk about some of the benefits for us. So well, benefits for us and benefits for the student, I guess. So now, as I mentioned previously, we've been using SFIA for this assessment for many years now, and it works really well for us, and it works really well for the students as well. So for me, one of the really key benefits, I guess, is that it really helps students when they're in an interview situation. It helps them just to articulate their learning development and work experience and what they've gained from that placement year. So one of the things we find is that students get a huge amount of benefit from the placement. We see when they come back that their skills, their confidence, their knowledge, it just goes absolutely through the roof. But students still sometimes struggle to kind of get that across in an interview situation. But using SFIA to assess them in this way really helps. So what we find is that students can look at the technical skills that they've gained, they can look at those learning objectives they've worked towards, and that helps them understand exactly what they've got from the placement and allows them to put that learning into kind of words that is going to resonate with an employer in an interview, and they're going to really understand. So it's really beneficial from that point of view for us. Another key benefit is kind of at the start of the placement, just that planning and objective setting process. So again, for most of our students, this is the first sort of professional experience that they've had. So they really don't know what they want to get out of the placement or really what to expect. But when students are able to kind of see the framework and look through the framework beforehand, they look at the types of skills they might be working towards, they look at those learning objectives, and it gives them a really good idea of the kinds of things they could be doing on placement and the kinds of things they could be getting out of it. So when they then go into that kind of initial meeting with their line manager, and obviously the company has got a good idea of what they want the students to get out of the placement, but it makes it a two-way process because the student can then be an active participant. You know, they've been able to see the types of things they could get from the placement, and the student can think about that, you know, and then contribute in that kind of objective setting process. So it gives the students a bit of knowledge and kind of understanding that they wouldn't have previously been able to have. And then I think for us as a university, you know, when we're assessing the placement, what we really wanted to be sure of is, you know, we don't want to just come up with what we think students get out of the placement, but to assess students against an industry recognised standard just, I think, gives it a lot more credibility, and, you know, it ensures that we're aligning the skills that students are getting with what industry wants, rather than us just sort of, you know, creating it ourselves. I think that's really valuable for us as well. And then another thing that I think the students really find useful is this kind of career exploration and mapping kind of process. So when a student sort of, well, partway through the placement, when they get to the end of the placement and start thinking about what they want to do longer term, the framework gives them a really good means of kind of exploring that. So let's say a student has worked towards and achieved level 3 in programming on their placement and thinks, great, I really want to consider this as a career path. They can then use the framework to look at what level 4, what level 5, what level 6 looks like, you know, start to think about if they pursued a career in that area, what they would be doing. They can look at the different levels of the behaviours and look at what skills they might need. So it really gives them that flavour of a kind of, you know, being able to think about what the future might look like. And although we assess students against 2 different skills, actually they'll end up using a variety of other skills from the framework to a lesser extent as well. So again, if a student does like a mini project in a different area and that really appeals to them, again, the framework gives them that opportunity to look at what type of work might be involved in a career in that area. So it's really valuable for that kind of planning exercise, I think. Yeah, and then the last point I've got on there is around just certification and accreditation. Students really like to be able to put on their CV at the end of the placement that they've achieved certain levels in SFIA, and again, it goes on their CV. It's a talking point in interviews, and you know, it's another beneficial thing for students to kind of put on their CV. So I think overall you can see that for us it just really fits with the way we do our placement assessment, and you know, the students get a lot from using it. And it really helps them with their kind of future career and that career planning. So overall, you know, it's a really valuable tool for us and something that we think works really well for what we use it for. And I think that's all the kind of content that I've got. I'll go back to Peter for any questions, but I've also just put my email address on there as well. So if anyone does want to contact me kind of after the session, please feel free to do so.
Thanks, Luke. Actually, that's a good reminder that on the final slide, we're going to have a link to a short form, and what we've found from the webinars is that people are interested in continuing the discussion in a bit more detail and a bit more discussion oriented than we can do on a webinar. So if you are interested in doing that, please follow the link on the form that's coming. And thanks to Luke for offering to share his email address. You know, get in touch if you need to do that. So, oh, there's a QR code there as well, which if you can get that to work, it was working yesterday, so that will take you to the form as well. So let's go to some of the questions. Now we've got one from Michelle, which is from before you went through the details. So I'll go through. You may feel that we've already covered it, but let's get a chance to cover those. And Michelle, you know, please get back if it's not quite answering what you're asking. So Michelle said that you mentioned that you're responsible for student employability. What do you do to align the skills the students are selecting with the skills employers are looking for?
So I mean, I think so. One of the things that, so obviously once a student actually is in a placement and is then making their selection of the skills, at that point they're obviously already in a role, and so the employer is kind of guiding them towards what skills are going to be of interest, at least to that individual employer. So I guess that would be the kind of first part of the answer. I don't know if that really answers your question. So I guess it's more aligned to what the student is actually doing on their placement rather than kind of thinking about the future. But obviously at that stage, the student has already secured a placement. So in a way, they've kind of demonstrated those skills at that point already.
Yes, Michelle, maybe you could just put in the chat, because it could be a general question you're saying, as what employers as a whole are looking for, or I think as Luke was saying, a more specific. When you're on an assignment, it becomes more straightforward to do that. So I'll leave that open just to give you a chance to come back. Lawrence has asked a question around the project management competencies. So saying, this is a great objective foundation for students. Towards the end of their placement, do you also cross-reference to the UK Association of Project Management, the APM competence framework for project management? And Lawrence is thinking they may already have achieved some of these competencies.
Yeah, so it's a good point actually. So we don't, but it's an interesting point that you raise, and I think it's something that I could potentially look into. But yeah, thanks for raising that, because that is an interesting point.
Okay, thanks for that. Porrick's asked a question. I know Porrick has left, but and I didn't understand the question fully, so I'll ask you it, Luke. And if you don't understand it, we'll leave it for later. So Porrick said, does this get included in the student's transcript?
Yes, yeah, it does. So the year in industry grows on the student's transcript at the end of their degree course. So yeah, it's officially a credited part of their course, and it goes on their transcript. Yeah.
Okay. Could you explain what a transcript is for us who aren't familiar?
Yeah. So essentially, once the students graduated, they get as well as like their overall certificate for completing their degree, they get a kind of breakdown of what they've done, so all the different modules they've done, and as part of that, the year in industry will be on there as one of the modules they've completed. Okay,
thank you. And then Io has asked, how do you assess the placement? So you mentioned the formative, and I was commenting that's quite straightforward, but what about the normative assessment based on a semantic approach?
Yeah, so essentially in terms of the assessment, so I guess you've got the two components, because you've got the learning objectives, which are what we require as a university for the students to demonstrate. So they're essentially the module outcomes. So the student must give evidence that they've met all those core objectives, as well as at least two of the additional ones. So that is the pass-fail university aspect. Then, as I say, obviously we do that grading against the SFIA skills, and again, you know, we look at whether students have met the level 3 behaviours, and we look at whether students have met all of the requirements for the technical skills, and we'll just assess against that and make a judgment on whether students have met the requirements for the level 3 or not.
Okay. And Michelle's got back. Thank you, Michelle. Probably should open the mic up, let you have a chat. So Michelle was saying that a question was more broadly about the skills that employers are looking for. So I guess we're saying, you know, as a university and the curriculum and the placements you do, how do you try and make sure they're aligned to what industry needs? If you've got some industry steering groups or something like that around that helps with that.
Yeah, so I guess there's kind of two aspects to this really. So one, in terms of the course itself, we try and ensure that, you know, we're covering what industry we want from our course. So we have, for instance, an employer advisory board where we've got a range of employers that we kind of work with, and they give their input in terms of course content, and whether we're providing students with what they need for industry. That advisory board will also advise more broadly as well, in terms of extracurricular stuff that we run. So we have a whole series of employability events and activity that we run with students, where again we're looking to build up those skills and kind of make sure they have the skills that industry needs. A lot of that will be industry led, so we'll get industry to deliver sessions on a range of different topics and activities again, so we're ensuring that students do have the skills that industry need when they, you know, come to look for jobs. Okay,
thanks, Luke. Now, Phil, you've asked a question. I'm not quite sure I fully understand that one, so I'll ask Luke it. And Ian, I know you wanted to make some comments overall as well. So the question from Phil was, what approaches do you think are most successful to student over self-assessment? Oh, I got it now. So when students are over assessing themselves, I think you mentioned that.
Oh, okay, yeah. So if a student is thinking they're working at level 4, but
and if that's not right, please get back. But I think that's what you got.
So I guess it's just a case. So when we have those kind of supervision meetings with students, we always talk through the kind of journal with the students. So we'll read their journal, like the current working draft of the journal, see what students are currently assessing themselves against, and then obviously we can then make that judgment ourselves. And then it's just a case of really of having that discussion with the student, and kind of, if they are over assessing, explain to students why we feel that that's the case. Or even just saying to students, you know, if you really think you are working at this level, this is the things that you need to do to demonstrate that you actually are. So I guess it's just having that two-way conversation with students and being clear about what they need to achieve to reach certain levels, and just pushing back a little bit if they're kind of over assessing, essentially. That's what I'd say, really, I think.
I wonder, because you look at both the behaviours and the technical skills, we know from industry, you know, there's a temptation for some people to pick and choose little phrases from some of the different skills and skill levels and say, well, I'm doing that, therefore I should be at level 4. But I think with the balance of the behavioural skills at level 4, you know, then that is another way that you're able to bounce into that. Is that?
Yeah. Yeah, in my experience, absolutely. So if a student's assessing at level 4, typically, as you say, they've looked at the level 4 technical skill, seen a couple of phrases that seem to match what they're doing. But actually, if you say to the student, actually, look at these level 4 behaviours, are you meeting all these behaviours? The answer is generally no, but the student hasn't necessarily looked at those behaviours and actually thought about those. So I'd absolutely agree with that, Peter. Yeah.
Okay. Right, Ian, did you want to?
Yes, I just wanted to say a couple of things, really, because I'm really impressed with this work, because it shows a really useful use of SFIA in preparation for people moving into employment. And one of the things that we've been asked to look at as a foundation is, sort of phrased by industry as bridging the gap between education and employment. And I think this is a great opportunity to show an example of how York are doing that. The issue of assessment is a really interesting one, in that, as Luke said, this has been going on for sort of longer than he's been there. So on the basis you've been there 4 years, I'm going to say it's 5+ years that this has been going on. And I think it's a great initiative in that sense of determining whether some student has achieved some level of practice of these skills. The SFIA Foundation has introduced an assessment scheme with regards to interest in industry around digital credentials, digital badging, and whilst I'll say that's still embryonic, it's been running for a few months, and we focus on recognizing the difference between knowledge and proficiency or skill in a controlled environment and competence of a demonstrated experience of performing a skill in a workplace. And I think that it's worth recognizing two things. First of all, that scheme is beginning to gain more interest and more ground. It is offered by a number of currently only 2 assessment organizations, and digital credentials can be issued by in one case Australian public sector for their own employees, and also through an APMG scheme. And we've tried and focus on recognizing the difference leading to full proficiency competence within the workplace. And I think this is just a great example of that. And I think there's an opportunity of actually enabling organizations, universities like York, for example, to turn their assessments of their students into formal SFIA recognized credentials, which I think would be would add another level of value to them for future employment. So that's all I really wanted to say, but we have a scheme going. We define knowledge, we define skill or proficiency, and we define competence, and we're working with many others to try and actually get this consistent across universities and the workplace in general.
Thank you, Ian. I'm just going to close this down now. We run these webinars for the first time this year. They've been really successful, very popular, and thanks to Luke and all the others who have given up their time, volunteered to tell their story. I think, as I said at the beginning, we've tried to encourage people just to say what they do. There's no spin or structure that says you must talk about these things. We're really interested in just how people use them. We're going to have a short break on these now because we're heading into holiday period. And we're probably going to be back around the end of January, maybe early February. We'll do another one. We're very keen if other people are willing and able to run one of these, explain how they use SFIA, just talk about what they're doing. Hopefully you've got the idea. It's quite informal and really valuable to the community. So please let us know if that's of interest or that you're willing to do that. There's no other questions, so I'm just going to say thanks very much for everyone for coming, and a big thank you to Luke, who's worked really hard on putting this together, and all the stuff that we've done to share this with the community. So thank you, Luke.